Welcome to the Profiled Corner. Today's video is part 6 in the Introduction to Woodworking Routers series. This video covers creating straight grooves and dados in boards using routers. A little bit of a follow-up from the last video. I mentioned that I was having difficulty seeing due to not enough light down inside when I was working on routers. Especially with this particular base, and also in previous videos when I was cutting the engraved sign. I found a small light on Amazon that I could double stick tape to the front frame here, or even mount it potentially onto the router itself and then direct the light down inside. This has 3 light illumination levels. And it was just a real cheap unit. It charges using USB, so it has a built-in battery that charges using USB, and it has 3 light levels. There's the low, medium, and then high. And that should provide quite a bit of light down inside when a router does not have built-in light, like these Bosch routers and various other routers. I know that some of the old routers did have embedded lights in them, like the old Craftsman routers. But anyway, this may be an option for you. It's only a couple dollars. I'll put a link to it in the description of this video if you're interested in it. And as I said, its neck is able to fold into different directions, and you can put some double-sided tape here to attach it to different surfaces. So that may be an option for you. Another thing that I ran into here is a book that I bought in the 1980s. It looks like I paid $10.88 based on the sticker that's on the back of this. This book was sold by Craftsman, or Sears Craftsman, and it shows various different things you can do with a router. This was written by, I believe, David Spielsman was his name. He also wrote versions of this book that were not specific to Sears products. This book was originally published in 1982 or 1983, and was republished in 1984 for Sears, and they've substituted in quite a bit of the Sears products into this to make it look like it's special for Sears products. Those products obviously are not available anymore, but there are versions of this book on both Amazon and eBay for an extremely cheap price, and it has a lot of good details in it, and it may give you a lot of good ideas on what you can do with a woodworking router other than what I've shown in this series. There's even talk in here that some people may actually need 2 or 3 routers, but those are usually professionals. I think I've got a couple more than 2 or 3 routers, and it also mentions in here that most people will not need a plunge router. I think things have changed quite a bit since the 1980s, and I think most people actually do need at least 1 plunge router, if not more than 1. Anyway, let's get into the video, and I'll show you some things that you can do to get straight edges when you're trying to cut dados or grooves in a board. So I need to make a couple changes here to what I've got on the workbench, and then we'll get started. What I have here is an 11-inch wide, 3/4 inch thick board, and I have a 1/2 inch wide groove or dado cut in here that I want to cut in. So for instance, if this were a shelf side or something like that, and I need to have a groove going through here for a shelf, that's what I'm attempting to create here, and I'll be doing that freehand. I have a 4-inch long, white side, 1/2 inch wide bit installed. It's a spiral cutter. So what I'm going to try to do is feed it in this direction, and we'll probably get some blowout on the back side where the bit exits. But what I want to do is look at how hard it is to control this router. Because the router bit spins in a clockwise direction, what's probably going to happen is that this router is going to tend to pull to the left. It's going to try to pull in that direction. So I'll have to try to hold it back to be able to make this straight cut. Now if I were smart, and I referred back to the sign making video that I did, I've got a straight line here and a straight line here. What I should probably do is take a straight edge and a sharp utility knife and score this line here and also this line here to make it a little bit easier to follow that straight line. But I'm not going to do that. I just want to see how difficult it is to freehand follow this line. And I want to see if the router tries to pull in this direction to the left. I have a small support board that I'm going to be placing here on the edge of the workbench to give me a little bit more support so that I can cut this groove 3/8 of an inch deep, and I have support for the router at the very edge of the workbench so that it's not quite so dangerous of a cut. Okay, so let's get started and see what happens. Okay, so I made it through the cut, and if you look closely here, you can see that the router pulled me in this direction right here, and also right here, and here again. Let's see, up in here, it looks like I got pulled again, and I was doing my best to keep it going in a straight line. Okay, so this is an important concept in that if we want to keep this going in a straight line, what we could do is we could put a board on here and clamp it down to the workbench and down to this board. But if we put it on this side, what's going to happen is that the router is going to try to drift away from this board if we attach it on this side. If we put the board over on this side, then the router should try to pull itself into the fence, and we should then get a straight cut. So we'll try that next. We'll try to put a straight board on the side over here and see if we get a straight cut this time rather than the slightly wavy cut that kept pulling to the left. Yeah, I found a reasonably straight board that I can use as a guide. I've drawn in another straight line here, or set of lines that are spaced a 1/2 inch apart. And then what I've done is I positioned the router right over here. I want to use the flat side rather than this rounded side of the base, because there's a possibility that if I was using the rounded side, if I tilt this router ever so slightly during the cut, the base of the router may not be fully centered around the bit. And so by using the flat side over here, I eliminate that possibility that it could shift ever so slightly in the cut and give me a wavy cut instead of a straight edge cut like we were after in the first place. So what I've done here is I put the router over the top of it, drop the bit down so that it looks like it's lined up on both sides, set the board down that I'll use as a fence, and then I used an old square that I have, and I just laid that across, and then I clamped the board that I'll be using it for the fence in place. Now there's a little bit of an issue here. Let me raise this back up. Normally you want to move the router from left to right or going counterclockwise. When we're making a full pass, it doesn't really matter, because if I were going from left to right, I'd be going in this direction right here, which is actually going to pull the router away from this fence, as we saw earlier. So I actually need to move the router in this direction, which is perfectly fine because we're making a full width pass. And so, in theory, that's the same as just doing it from this side and going across. We're still moving the router in the same direction, although I've got to use it this way to go across so that the router is going to try to pull itself into the fence because of the clockwise direction of the rotation of the bit. Okay, so let's get started here. I'm going to put in the 3/4 inch thick spacer out here so that there's some support for the router, and then we'll get started. I probably should have extended this fence out a little bit further this way, but we'll work with it where it's at. Okay, so this time we have a completely straight cut that we can confirm using the square. It's completely straight all along, and that's because the router was trying to pull itself into the fence that we put down instead of trying to pull away. There's a neat little thing that we can do with this router. Instead of starting out here on the end and going all the way through to the other end, we could actually create a stop dado in here very easily just by setting a stop point down here and a stop point down here, and then we can just use this plunge router to drop down at the starting point, move over, and then once we reach the ending point, we can lift up the router. And so it's very easy to make a stop dado cut, whereas that's very difficult to do on the table saw safely. And you would then have to clean it up, of course, using a chisel. And we don't have to do that, at least not as much of a cleanup on when we're using the router. We would have to square up the end of the cut, obviously, but that's not that big of a deal. Okay, so we've seen an easy way to cut straight using the router and the flat side of the base. What other ways can we cut this straight edge? Well, let's think about that a little bit here. We've got this method that's working pretty well. What if we take and extend this a little bit and we create something that looks like this? This is essentially a piece of 3/4 inch thick plywood here, 3/4 inch thick piece of plywood here, and then I've got a small piece of 3/4 inch thick plywood here that's also 3/4 of an inch wide, exactly 3/4 of an inch wide, and same up here. So what I've done here is I've created kind of a groove that we can use if we had a 3/4 inch wide guide bushing mounted to the router, which is the largest bushing that's provided in the Milwaukee and also the Porta-Cable guide bushing sets. We could then use this 1/2 inch router bit and just have it go right down through the center here using the guide bushing to keep it going in a straight line. So let's try that out. I've got to mount a guide bushing onto the router. So give me just a minute here to get that done. I have a Milwaukee body grip router set up here with ultimate router base attached to it, which was shown last week. Here it is here, the top of it. And on the bottom side, one of the neat things that it has is that it has this plate that mounts into it, and that allows attaching standard Porta-Cable style guide bushings to it, and it should be automatically centered within this, and it does look like it is. So I've got a Milwaukee 3/4 inch outside diameter guide bushing mounted into here, which will work with our 1/2 inch bit that I've got. I set the depth of cut by putting this onto the bottom and then using a 3/8 inch setup block to verify the depth of cut. And so that seems to work pretty well. This Ultimate router base also has a $33 accessory kit, and in the accessory kit is a 1-inch diameter guide bushing, which is not in the other set. So this guide bushing would then allow using a 3/4 inch diameter router bit if we wanted to make a dado that's 3/4 of an inch wide, or use the plywood, the special plywood bits, which are typically 1/32 of an inch undersized. So we'd be able to put in a plywood 3/4 inch panel into the board here in a dado. And so this is a 1-inch diameter, outside diameter bushing. And the kit also includes an adapter that makes it 1.25 inch diameter. So that would go on the outside. So you could use this if you're doing template routing with a 1/4 inch bit and you want to get on the outside of the template. That's when you'd use this adapter. And then there's also another adapter here that would go on the outside of this that would give you a 1/2 inch offset. So if you wanted to create an inlay using a 1/2 inch diameter bit, you could also do that. We had to use an 1/8 inch diameter router bit when we were creating an inlay using guide bushings. So this is an option, and this should fit into, I believe, anything that's compatible with the Portacable style guide bushings. So I'm using this Ultimate router base instead of mounting the clear plastic base onto this router like I did the last time. And so I didn't also have to install an adapter into one of the Bosch routers to be able to accept these Portacable style guide bushings. Okay, so I've got this set. What we need to do next is to mark out the location of where we want the next dado to go. I've got that marked here, and off to the left side of that, I've also marked an 1/8 inch over, which would then tell me where this edge of the guide needs to appear when it's placed onto the board, so that the slot that's going to be cut in here will be centered. So I'm going to take care of clamping this down to the board, and then we'll bring the camera back. The jig is set up on the board now. The unfortunate thing is, with a large base here, I had to spread these clamps out quite a bit. I should have made this template a little bit wider, which would have allowed a little bit better clamping surface here. But we'll make do with it as it is. So what we need to do is to actually reverse this around, because this dust collection port is going to be in the way. Okay, so now I've got it in a gap area here, so I can safely start it and then move it in that direction. I could actually cut it in either direction here, because now it's supported on both sides, so it's not able to pull to the left or pull to the right. So that would be one of the advantages of this approach. So let's try this out. Come to a full stop before pulling it out, because this is a fixed base router. Okay, now I probably should have gotten some blowout from this on this back side here, where you're going to be able to see where the bit exited. So let's take off the guide and see what happened. Okay, there's only just a little bit of chip out there. And what we could have done is put a backer board over here, maybe double-sided taped it to this, and then when the router bit exited, it would have not caused that chip out right there, or on these other cuts for that matter. So they gave us a straight cut, and that was nice and easy to be able to use that. In Norm Abrams' Router 101 video that I mentioned a couple videos ago for the New Yankee Workshop, he did something similar to this approach, but instead of using a guide bushing, what he did was he put a guide board here and also another guide board here. He put the router onto the template. So he had a guide board here and a guide board here, and then he was able to cut the slot whatever width it needed to be without being limited by guide bushing size. So that's another option of one thing that you could do if you prefer to use that method. Now with this approach, we could also use pattern bits and run the guide bearing for the pattern bit along these edges here, and we could in theory create a groove that's 3/4 of an inch wide, or a dado that's 3/4 of an inch wide, using the same template. Here are 3 pattern bits of different lengths that you might use with this template. Here, and then also this one here. And I would believe that you would use probably one this length. And what that would allow you to do then is to cut a 3/4 inch wide groove just by running down both sides of this pattern. And so that's another option for you with this template, or with a template like the one that Norm created. Okay, so we've got homemade templates here. What else can we do? Okay, the underside of this workbench along the table has a long groove that runs the entire length, all 4 feet of the table, and I needed to cut that groove so that it would nestle onto another board. I actually did that 3 times, both in the center and also on each side of the workbench. And to do that, I either needed to have a very straight board that was at least 4 feet long, or I needed a different approach. Last year, actually it's been 2 years now, I bought this Jorgensen saw guide that adapts from either being 4 feet long or 8 feet long for cutting plywood that's 4 feet long or 8 feet long. And it has a neat little clamp that's built into it. Here, I just released the clamp. There you can see the clamp on it. And I actually used this Jorgensen saw guide to guide the router. Now, unfortunately, it does not appear that this is sold on Amazon anymore. I know that there's Bora brand saw guides that look similar to this, still being sold on Amazon. I'm not sure why Jorgensen no longer sells this on Amazon, but they may sell it through other retailers. So this is one option to give us a straight edge. All that we got to do is figure out what the distance is from the edge of the router to the center of the router bit, and then we could just clamp this down just like so, and then we can run the router with the flat edge of the router once again up against this fence. And we would want to route in this direction from your left to your right so that the router tries to push itself into this fence. We wouldn't want to go this other direction because then it would be trying to pull away from the fence. and that would throw off your cut. So you'd want to go in this direction. Now I'm not actually going to cut this, but this is one method that you can use if you can't find a straight board. You can buy one of these. I believe that they were selling for a little over $60 on Amazon. This may be an option for you. You can also use it, once again, for guiding a circular saw along a straight edge when you're trying to cut down plywood. Okay, so let's look at some more commercial products after we take another look at a homemade product that I created 35 years ago for a special purpose. 30 to 35 years ago, I created garden benches to sell, and those garden benches required cutting mortises into either 4x4 or 4x6 posts. And I used this plunge router here to do that using a 1/2 inch wide spiral cutter bit. And I used a jig that looks like this to keep the router centered on the 4x4 or 4x6 post. This is just made up of essentially pieces of scrap wood, 2 dowels running through here as the guide rods, and then I actually use screws to go into here instead of these fancy twist lockdown posts. I use screws to go through there because I didn't have these at the time. And so what I would do is just slide it onto there, and then I could plunge it down, move over a 1/2 inch, plunge it down again, move over a 1/2 inch, plunge it down again, and keep on going right on down through. And then once I made it all the way to the other end, then what I could do is I can make partial passes from end to end to clear out any of the waste that's still left in the middle section. So what I'll do here, I have 2 mortises already cut on this side. I only have 1 mortise cut here because that was all that was actually needed for these garden benches. What I'm going to do though is to show you in the video how to cut another mortise down here using this guide that I have mounted on the router. And this is essentially, or 2 guide rails mounted on the router at the same time. So it's an extension of what we were doing earlier, but I've got one mounted on each side and they're movable. Okay, so let me get this clamped down to the table and then we'll get started. Now I have a 4-inch long white side router bit, 3 flute, mounted in the router here. It's a 1/2 inch wide and it has a 2-inch long cutting depth. I'm only going to be cutting down 1.5 inches deep, and unfortunately the boards back then, especially the pressure treated boards, they were typically just over 3.5 inches wide, and unfortunately this redwood board has shrunk a little bit over time. Now it's less than 3.5 inches wide, so there's a little bit of a gap on this side here. So what I need to do then is just use this other side of the router sled to keep it lined up correctly. Okay, so I've got the router bit set just over the board, and now that it's set at the end stop, and then we're ready to get started now. So that's done. The only issue that I have is that the mortise is supposed to be back here. That's okay, this is just a test piece. It's not going to hurt anything. Let's roll over to another edge and we'll try that again. That went pretty doggone fast. So it's supposed to be 3.5 inches from the end. And then the other side is supposed to be at 3.5 to 5.5. Obviously, you wouldn't want to make this mistake on a real project. There we go, 3.5 to 5.5. Okay, we're positioned right, and we're ready to get started. Okay, so we're done. There's the way it was supposed to look on the other edge, and that was cut extremely fast. And you can do that very easily with a plunge router using an edge guide. Next up, I'm going to show you some commercially made edge guides that go to different routers. Next, let's talk about commercially available edge guides. I have mounted onto my nearly 35-year-old Bosch 1611 EVS router a commercial edge guide, model number RA1054. This edge guide will fit onto various different routers in addition to this nearly 35-year-old Bosch 1611 EVS. In addition to this, it'll also work on this Bosch 1619 EVS router. It'll work on a Bosch 1617 EVS router, both the fixed base and the plunge base. But it will not work on a Bosch 1604 router. This has a different width for the guide posts. I believe it's about 2 3/4 inch, and they're blocked by the handle right here. So I'm not sure what type of an edge guide you would use for this. So this is one example of a commercially available edge guide. Let's move some of these routers out of the way. There's also another type. It's called a Portacable 42690. There's a type 1 and a type 2. This is a type 1, and here you can see that it has guideposts that fit into the end in 2 different positions. The unfortunate thing about this particular type 1 model is that I have up on the French cleat wall behind me 4 different full-size routers that are Portacable brand and a trim router, and this type 1 fence only fits into one of those routers. I picked up this at an estate auction at a pretty good discount. Unfortunately, it only included these very short posts. If these posts were longer, this may also work in a Milwaukee body grip router. Well, fortunately, I found on eBay last year 2 of these unopened Type 2 42690 Portacable edge guides. This one's still unopened. I'm saving this for later. I've adapted one of these so that it'll work in a Milwaukee body grip router. These come with 3 different size guideposts that you can put into one of 3 different positions. Here's the largest guidepost, and that's meant to go into this outer edge, the outer holes here, and that's for the very large plunge routers, like the one that I've got up on my French cleat wall. And then there's a mid-size, which is this one here, and then there's a small size, which is similar to the one that's shipped with the Type 1, except that it's longer. I'm thinking that this longer one this longer post would probably be compatible with the Milwaukee body grip router. I did not test that out. However, what I did instead was I took the mid-size post, mounted this into a drill chuck, and then I took it to a grinder and I ground this down so that it was exactly the right size to fit into a Milwaukee body grip router like this one here. And normally these mid-size posts are supposed to go into the second hole, but for the Milwaukee router they actually have to go into the innermost hole. This particular Porta-Cable edge guide, the Type 2, should also be compatible with this 34-year-old, or nearly 34-year-old, Milwaukee 2 horsepower router. It should have roughly the same spacing as some of the Porta-Cable routers. I don't recall exactly what that spacing is. It may be 3 inches apart or slightly over 3 inches. And that's one of the spacing options on this particular edge guide. Okay, so in addition to these edge guides being able to guide the router in a straight line, they also have another feature that may not be well known. So in addition to going in a straight line, there's an option to change out parts. Here's a little part that could go on to the bottom of this. By removing these 3 screws, this whole fence assembly comes off, and then this post goes in place of this screw that's right here. And that turns this into a circle cutting jig instead of an edge guide. You could check the documentation for this particular unit to see what size circles it supports. That same functionality is also available for this Bosch edge guide, although you've got to do some other things to it to turn it into a circle cutting jig, but it will also do that as well. Okay, so let's see this in action. I'm going to clear a couple of these things off the table so I've got a little more room to work, and then we'll come back. One more thing that I should point out. The Porta-Cable edge guide that I showed you earlier, that's designed to work with a Porta-Cable 690 series router, like this one, and also the Porta-Cable 890 series router. But both the Type 1 and Type 2 edge guides will work with these. The Type 2 also works with a large router. If you're going to source one of those edge guides from eBay, you've got to make sure that you're getting all 3 sets of the guideposts that go into it, and also the circle attachment. Otherwise, you may not be able to use it with your router. So if possible, try to find one that's not opened, that's still in the same package. I looked on eBay today and I did not see any listed out there, but there'll surely be a couple more popping up. I think I paid somewhere around $60 to $70 for the last one that I ordered. The other one, I believe I paid right around $40 to $50 for it. They're a little bit expensive, but if you need a commercially made edge guide, they're probably worth buying. Some of the cheaper routers and some of the trim routers actually have an edge guide that looks like this. I had to buy this one for a Bosch trim router or palm router. One of the other routers that I got, the battery operated one, came with a similar looking edge guide. I'm not sure why, but one of the Milwaukee routers that I got off eBay came with an edge guide that looks like this. I'm not real sure how that's supposed to be functional on the Milwaukee router. I can see that these 2 posts could go into the router, but you don't have very much room here or adjustment for different locations with this particular setup, unless these guide bars are much longer than that. And so maybe that is the expected option to be used on those Milwaukee body grip routers, but they'll work with a porta-cable edge guide that I showed you with a little bit of modification. Okay, so let's take a look at what it's going to take to route another groove here, another dado, this time using a commercially made edge guide. I have the edge guide set up. Now the only question is, what direction do we need to move the router? Do we need to move it in this direction, or do we need to move it in this direction so that the router pulls the fence into the edge of the board? Well, we found when we guided it freehand that when we went in this direction here, the router was trying to go that direction constantly, and so he was fighting me. And so we can actually take that into advantage again here, because our edge guide is mounted over on the right side of the router. It's on your left side, but it's on the right side of the router from my perspective. If we have it here, we should be able to move the router in the same direction as before, and when the router pulls in this direction, it should actually pull this edge guide tight against the end of the board. So let's give that a shot and see if it actually works. And I'm actually going to cut a stop dado this time with a router instead of going all the way through the end. Okay, so that cut pretty cleanly. I was having a little bit of difficulty here at the start because the little bit of a gap here in the fence was actually getting caught on the edge of the board. And so I could have tightened up that gap and that would have taken care of that problem, but I didn't do that. So here's an example of a stop dado in a board cut with an edge guide, and obviously I could cut that using just a simple board clamped across if I wanted to. This particular edge guide has a micro adjust feature on it. I very rarely use that. To use that, what you do is you'd lock down these two knobs here to the rail, and then you'd leave these two loose, and then you could use this micro adjust feature to move this fence in and out. There's a little bit of slop in it, as you can see here, but it does work. Okay, that's all for today. Thanks for watching. Bye!